Guys, it's bad. It's much worse than I thought. I hope you're sitting down right now, because this made even me mad. Hey everyone, look, first of all, hey, thanks so much for all the comments on my first video. I really didn't plan on making another video anytime soon. I was just expecting to do it every 45 days per updates. But then Scott, thank you Scott for making the suggestion to compare all the previous videos that have already been released to show the improvements in them. I thought, man, that's a great idea. I want to do it, So I started researching, started digging in, started looking through old video, and my jaw hit the floor. I couldn't believe it. Just really made me mad what I found. In all honesty, I always thought the Microdrone 4.0 would be something fun to kind of tear apart and tinker with. Maybe take the little gimbal and put it on a brushless drone and play with it there. But I think all that's out the window now. I think it's got zero value add for me. So let me show you. In my research, I started watching this video right here. Did you catch it? Here, let me replay it and I'll slow it down a bit here. Yep. So down the rabbit hole I went. So with all the videos been released in this campaign, I've always noticed there was a jerkiness to it. Just assumed it was the gimbal not fully doing its job. And there were so many other distractors in the video that I actually never thought to look at the frame rate. With a drone touted as, a drone that can shoot, buttery smooth cinematic footage, I always assumed it would shoot at least 30 frames per second, But once I noticed this, I started going back and looking, and it shows up several places throughout the campaign. So I go back to the homepage, the story page of the campaign, and I start scrolling through there and looking for anything that defines the frame rate at which this camera shoots, and it's not there. But what is there, however, curiously, is this GIF. It shows up there too. So every video that's been released since this campaign has launched has been 20 frames per second. Even my little Xiaomi Mi 2 that I used in comparison in my last video, that guy only shoots in 720p, but it still records at 30 frames per second. 20 frames per second will never create a decent video or anything near cinematic. So since the videos are already out there and they're already encoded in 30 frames per second, I couldn't think of really solid way of proving. However, whenever you take something from 20 frames per second and you render it out in 30 frames, you're not adding any data whatsoever. So you can take that 30 frame per second rendering and render it back out at 20 frames per second, and you'll see differences where the file's been processed more, but you don't notice a huge difference. There's no degradation in the quality or the movement because it's still 20 frames per second. So I took that hallway video that I was working with in my first video and I rendered it out at 20 frames per second. So here's the original. And here is the 20 frames per second. So now I'll show you both of the videos side by side, and you can see they look pretty similar. You can tell there's a slight difference where one's been processed and re-rendered again, but there's really no difference in the movement. And I posted on there asking if the hardware had been changed since the prototype. And Vernon replied saying, no, it hasn't. So then I asked, what's the max recording rate of the drone? And he replied, 30 frames per second at 1080p. So I asked him, well then why have you not released any 30 frames per second video? And I'm still awaiting a response for that. I don't have an answer there. Because in my head, if you're putting a update video out to impress your backers, why would you not want to show them the best possible video? And why are you recording at 20 frames per second instead of the 30 frames, if it can do 30 frames? Because that's a huge difference. This reminds me a whole lot of update number 17, where he showed the outdoor footage that was filled with jello. So in that footage, or excuse me, in that update, he actually wrote, the raw footage here can be further enhanced with electronic image stabilization, EIS. And apart from the story page, this is the only time that EIS has been mentioned or talked about in this entire campaign. You know, I questioned then, I'm like, you know, if you're going to make the video better with EIS, why did you not do it in the update to show the best possible product? You know, I don't think EIS exists with this. I don't think it's there. And now I worry that 30 frames per second doesn't exist with this. You know, it's one of those things that tries to get slid under the radar, and if you don't acknowledge it, it doesn't exist. And to me, this is huge. This is, you know, with, you know, the GIF on the story page, you know, this was something that was there from the very beginning, showing 20 frames per second. You know, when the only, you know, the marketing video that was released, all the footage that was supposedly from the Microdrone 4.0 from the marketing video is all in 30 frames per second. None of it is in 20, but yet at the same time, you're releasing a GIF clearly showing 20 frames per second. You know, I'm really at a loss here. I think the EIS and the 30 frames per second are things that will actually never happen. Okay, so now, just as I said that you can take video that was originally recorded in 20 frames per second, render it to 30, doesn't add any data, you can render it back out at 20, and you pretty much still have the same thing. You cannot do that with 30. If you take 30 frames per second and you render it down to 20, you lose a lot of frames. You lose a third of all of your frames. So let's take the Bay video that supposedly was recorded from the Microdrone 4.0. And here it is as presented to us when selling us the drone. And here's that same video now rendered out at 20 frames per second. Now, here are the two side by side. You notice there is a big difference. If I had known it was potentially going to be capped out at 20 frames per second, I definitely would have never backed. So, in closure, I don't know if 30 frames per second is an achievable goal. Vernon says it records at it, but has yet to demonstrate it, much like the EIS in Update 17. He says it's there, but I think they're just on a list of bullet points of nice to haves and hopes to finish. So in all honesty, I feel as though unless 30 frames per second is actually proven, then there is 0 point whatsoever in ever creating another comparison video, because it's 20 frames per second. And that's never going to cut it. Oh, and by the way, if you want to see the outdoor footage with EIS, here, I'll put it here. Yeah, it still looks like 20 frames per second crap.